Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. Before we get into our very thrilling second segment of today's show, I do want to remind you, as always, to avail yourselves of the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube, as well as our website, gsmcspodcast.net, to better contribute and interact with our live shows a little bit more directly, whether it be through your opinions, any feedback, any input you have for our shows, or even tips and donations. Everything involved with this process is greatly appreciated, and this makes our shows that much better when you, our faithful audience, are contributing to them. Without further ado, let's recap the thrilling conclusion of the four nations face-off between the US and Canada, shall we? What a game of hockey. A game billed as even bigger than the Stanley Cup certainly lived up to the hype at TD Garden last night. Incredible play from both sides. Incredible savvy play, incredible defensive play, incredible goaltending from both Hellebuyck and Binnington, which we'll talk about a lot throughout the course of this segment. But it all came down to one man, left wide open in the slot. The most talented player in all of hockey, Connor McDavid, scoring the OT winner, and giving Canada the Four Nations final, and ultimately launching them into a future where they can still have supremacy over the U.S. until the 2026 Winter Olympics in Italy, but the U.S. should not hang their heads low. In fact, they played a fantastic game that ultimately was just decided by a very talented player and just the savviness and finesse of this Canada team. But what I really liked about this game is it reminded us of the beauty of hockey, because the first game was a very physical affair. 3 fights within the first 9 seconds, 64 hits over the course of 3 periods. And this game, it was all about finesse, feeling each other out, battling to the very end, and ultimately it had to come down to big-time players making big-time plays, and ultimately leaving McDavid wide open in the slot was a terrible decision by Team USA in that moment. But as an Edmonton Oilers fan, I was like, if it's anyone beating the US, it has to be Connor McDavid, right? He's meant for these big moments. But it was more than just Connor McDavid. It was about both of these teams battling it out for their countries, the pride of their flags, and ultimately delivering the hype for this magnitude of game. So, without further ado, let's just jump into it more, talk about the players that made a big difference, and talk most importantly about the depth of both squads and what this potentially mean for those Olympics in Italy in 1 year time. Obviously, we can talk about, McDavid, herald him as one of the game's greatest stars right now, if not the greatest star at this current moment in time. It was more than just him. Let's talk about these two goaltenders, right? Everyone knew that Connor Hellebuyck was playing the best at the goalie position headed into this tournament for Winnipeg. Heavy favorite right now for the Vezina Trophy, and potentially the Hart Trophy favorite as well. Be the first goaltender since Carey Price for Montreal won it in 2015 if that happened. And he was magnificent in this game. Canada had to beat him with finesse and savvy and their incredible skill from their frontline skaters, but Hellebuyck ultimately withstood the challenge and he was fantastic in net. But it was all about the rejuvenation of Jordan Binnington, turning back the clock to 2019 when he was just a young rookie playing for the St. Louis Blues in the very same arena where he won that game last night. Incredible performance, especially in overtime. An incredible save to deny Matthew Tkachuk that almost led to that goal immediately after. And Binnington truly put on a clinic in keeping his team in this game. If it weren't for him, I feel like the USA, in terms of their forwards, creating havoc in that zone, really could have led to them winning this game. They created enough high-danger chances, and ultimately, Gensel, Tkachuk, Matthews were frustrating that Canadian defense all night. But Binnington stood tall, took this game into overtime, ultimately was, quote-unquote, the better goaltender in overtime, even though both of them played miraculously within the first 8 minutes of that overtime before the goal. So, just goes to show that an unsung hero can emerge when you play in these kind of tournaments, and it just happened to be Binnington. But then, let's look at the most important factor of this game. Depth. Depth for both teams. Not just Canada, but the U.S. Remember, the U.S. without two of their best blue liners in Quinn Hughes, who was a last-minute scratch, I believe, because of an upper body injury, and then Charlie McAvoy with a similar situation. In the first game, McAvoy was immense for this U.S. squad. Absolutely immense. Physical in the forecheck, physical in terms of acquiring hits. Just an incredible player in that game. But then look at the depth that the U.S. were able to call upon in his absence. Jake Sanderson stepping up and scoring a very important goal that gave the U.S. the lead early in the second. And then a guy like Jacob Slavin putting his body on the line for his country. An absolutely underappreciated defenseman, not just on the international circuit, but in terms of the NHL as well. Really incredible player. And then for the Canadians, it was more about a guy coming back and adding depth to their blue line than a guy being absent. The ability to call on a guy like Cale Makar is incredible to behold because he potentially is one of the best young defensemen in the entire world right now. And then a guy like Sam Bennett stepping up, a guy like Thomas Harley stepping up in Josh Morrissey's stead. All of these guys in critical moments, Sam Bennett getting the game-tying goal that ultimately sent it to overtime. So, a lot of questions answered about both of these teams' depth, and really, it just came down to who won certain moments, in my opinion. And one thing that I can't help but notice about games of this magnitude is that it calls upon a lot more than just tactics. It calls upon the ability to focus and understand that this isn't all about you as an individual hockey player. It's about a team effort. And both of these teams, because they have so much experience in these situations, that they had the depth necessary to fight for almost over an hour and a half of play in a very high-stakes environment at TD Garden is incredible to behold. And not even the best players, potentially, for these certain countries that came up in big moments. No one expected Jake Sanderson potentially to score such a pivotal goal in a winner-take-all game. No one expected someone like Brady Tkachuk to be one of the most passionate leaders of the U.S. in this tournament. And yet there they were. No one expected Jordan Binnington to stand at his head. In fact, many people were probably clamoring for more minutes for other goalkeepers for the Canadians, like Aiden Hill and Sam Montalbo, maybe even a guy like Logan Thompson, although I don't necessarily think he was fully healthy for this tournament. But I do think that the unsung heroes really made a difference for these squads. Now let's talk about how all this transitions to 2026 in the Winter Olympics, and specifically about two specific players that are going to be called into questions for their respective squads. The first one being Sidney Crosby. And it's remarkable how at the age of 38 he has so much left to give for this Canada squad. In fact, he was their leading point scorer. He was their leading point scorer with 1 goal and 4 assists in the entire competition, playing through a hand injury that clearly affected him, and ultimately still delivering for this squad. But the question is, how much more does he have to give? Because there are a lot of talented Canadian forwards on the come up, and I'm not certain that Sidney Crosby is going to be seen as a high-end player in the next year. He's going to be a year older. Potentially he could come back as more of a vocal presence for this squad, but I don't see him leading this team on the ice. And then On the other side of the coin, you have a guy in Austin Matthews whose narrative is just getting ever more disappointing in terms of how he profiles as one of the great players of his generation. He's now 0-7 in winner-take-all games. And that paints a bleak picture of how people are going to view him. He's still one of the most generational talents we have right now in the hockey world. But if he isn't delivering on the game's biggest stages, what are we going to think of him in the future? There's a reason he was named captain of the squad. But until he proves that he can play a pivotal role in these meaningful games, I don't know how people will view his career in the very near future. But in terms of more pressing issues as a collective for both of these squads, let's talk about Canada's goalie conundrum here. Because the fact that they were willing to put in guys like Hill and Montalbo in specific moments is pretty critical of the assessment of Canada's goalie situation. Will they really rely on someone like Jordan Binnington in a much more high-stakes environment, in my opinion, than a Four Nations face-off when you're going against the best teams in the world in the Winter Olympics? Because you have depth there, but it's just that you don't know how good your depth can be in big moments. Because, yes, Logan Thompson, in my opinion, has more value than Jordan Binnington in tournament-style moments. But then you have guys like Skinner and Kemper who are a little bit more unsettled in those situations, but still could offer you a lot. So I feel like that's the only major problem going forward for Canada, because they have a lot of depth to call upon. And then for the U.S., questions about how they compete if, the blue line's a major issue going forward. Because obviously, this could have been a very different game if Quinn Hughes and Charlie McAvoy were playing. But you can't ultimately look back at this and say, oh, woe is me, because we didn't have two of our best blue liners, we lost this game. No, you're going to have to take it on the chin and assess how you can improve that aspect of your game. But most importantly, what I love about this game is that it didn't set either team back ahead of the Winter Olympics. In fact, it gave them a little bit more to springboard further their chances of competing in the Winter Olympics against teams that will be there like Sweden and Finland as well. So that's why I think that this game is certainly something that both teams can take a lot away from. But let me know what you think about that conclusion last night. Because coming up next, we transition back actually to the world of basketball. We preview a very high-stakes game in the Eastern Conference between the Knicks and Cavs. One of three meetings these teams will have down the stretch. We'll be right back after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC